Welcome to our video slideshow of nostalgic downtown Morris on the historic I&M Canal. I am Ken Sereno and will be your narrator. I was born in the Morris Hospital over 70 years ago and was in business at Route 47 Buchanan Street for 48 years before retiring in 1995. I had no hobbies and worried about how I could adjust to retirement. I read about the Downtown Development Group being organized and thought that would be interesting. It consists of 20 business people and interested citizens organized with the object to promote the downtown and compete with the shopping centers. The downtown is a reflection of the whole town. I collected postcards of Morris and got the idea that if the stores had a history of their building on display, it would connect the people to their past. After having a full house for 2 slide presentations, the Morris Library decided to sponsor the production of a video program for posterity. Thanks go to the library and Debbie Steffes for all her help. We're going to take you on a trip up the east side of Liberty Street from the canal to the railroad and back down the west side. Put your mind back to 1842 with no roads, cars, telephones, or electricity. Canal Town Morris goes back to the I&M itself. Now in retirement, the canal is preserved as the Gibbard Woods State Park Canal Access, a place of recreation for area residents. Today, jogging and fishing have replaced the earlier pursuits of ice skating and pleasure boats. Built as a water highway connecting Lake Michigan to the Illinois River, it was soon lined with booming canal towns. 2 years after it was completed, in 1848, the population of Morris grew from 150 souls to 627 people. Logically, the building boom began along the line of the canal. This is how Canal Street, now Illinois Avenue, looked in 1881. This was the labor district crowded with farm wagons and teams of horses. This is where the Cooper shops were located. Eric Erickson specialized in pork and whiskey barrels. N.P. Wilson built well buckets and cattle troughs. Canal Street is where the blacksmith shops were located, and John Horry's wagon shop. There was a couple of grist mills on the canal, and grain elevators were among the first structures to appear, shipping corn, wheat, barley, and rye. McElwain's, shown here, was one of the earliest. It's often stated that the city of Chicago was built by lumber shipped on the I&M, so most canal elevators diversified into the lumber business. With all that stacked kindling, many of the early elevators burned. This one, built by McEwen in 1875 and sold to Hull in 1880, was quickly replaced after it burned in 1900. After a second fire in 1912, the last elevator was built of concrete and is still standing near the old train depot. Today, if you walk the canal towpath, you can see the ruins of other canal industries. This composite shows them all. In the foreground, Coleman Hardware, Gibbard Brewery on the right, and the Wolfel Tannery Stack is on the left. The Coleman Hardware building, which still stands at the end of Nettle Street, began in 1867 as a Hall Furniture Company. It was replaced by the Morris Iron Works. Then in 1874, Sherwood School Furniture bought the place for $1,100. This new owner started building a machine shop, a loading dock, a couple of large additions. He bought a neighboring foundry and barn and converted them into storage houses and built a 60-foot smokestack and bell tower at the east end of the old factory. By June of 1874, the company employed 120 men and boys and kept 2 teams of horses busy from morning till night carrying goods from the factory to waiting railroad cars, working until 10 p.m. to fill orders. Soon they took on custom wood and iron work. They also repaired farm machinery. In 1877, they made arrangements with S.H. Brainerd of Seneca Falls, New York, to manufacture their patent flexible harrow. But after fire destroyed the Sherwood plant, the Ohio Butt Company took it over and changed the name to Coleman Hardware. The Gibbard Brewery building still stands at the west end of Washington Street, built in 1866 by Louis Gibbard. It consists of 4 separate buildings. The main building was a brew house, 7 stories tall, with a fireproof boiler room in the rear. This housed the vats and brew kettles, where the brewer worked putting out 125 barrels of beer a day. The stock house was added in 1904, a 3-story steel structure where the brew was aged thousands of barrels at a time. Across the driveway to the south were the malt and bottling houses. This was one of the most modern and best equipped breweries in its day, and it was a good place to work. Gibbard's paid the highest wages in the city. Downtown you could buy a big glass of Gebhardt beer for a nickel. But Prohibition put all this out of business in 1920, and the brewery equipment was sold to William Sue and shipped to Shanghai. 2 years later, Dan Brown opened the Morris Milling Company here, which struggled on into the late 1950s. Using a specially patented process, Brown was able to preserve the wheat germ in his flour indefinitely. Usually it has to be separated out because it gets rancid, and bread made from this flour did have a yellowish color and distinctive flavor. He converted some of the old brewing equipment to aerate it. For years the old building stood empty, but the Gebhardt legacy lives on. William Gebhardt's widow, Adelaide, donated the money for nearby Gebhardt Woods State Park, selling the 34-acre parcel for $1,500. On the south bank of the canal, just west of Calhoun Street, stood the Wolfel Tannery. Built in 1868 by the Knoblich brothers, who made their fortune and sold out to George Wolfel and F. Gasperi. This building has been plagued with fires. At 9 a.m. on October 18, 1865, it was completely destroyed because the canal bridge was out and the Morris fire engine had no way of getting there. Discouraged, Mr. Gasperi sold his interest to Charles Spar. The firm became Wolfel and Spar. In 1857, they started a harness shop on Washington Street. Wolfel operated the tannery. Spar ran the boot, shoe, and harness shop across from the courthouse. Spar's shoe store stayed here long after the partnership dissolved in 1880. Wolfel Tannery manufactured harnesses and collars for horses, as well as boot and shoe leather. They specialized in fine-colored leathers, red, orange, and russet brown, used in collar boxes and suitcases. By 1888, after several additions, it was the largest tannery in the state of Illinois outside of Chicago. But spontaneous combustion took its toll. There was a fire in 1917, another in 1927. Today, all that's left are a couple of brick remains. In 1842, the little canal town of Morris covered 10 acres, bounded on the east by Cedar Street, Washington Street to the north, Calhoun Street to the west, and the canal on the south. The original town consisted of these 6 blocks. Block number 5 was designated as the Courthouse Square, where the first public building was erected. This imposing structure stood on the northeast corner, built and paid for by William Armstrong, sponsor of the bill creating Grundy County. It measured 20 feet by 40 feet, 2 stories, with a bell on top to call court into session. It was built of hardwood lumber cut at his brother George's sawmill on the Wapakon Creek, some 3 miles southwest of Morris. Pine lumber was only available from Chicago, and it had to be shipped by canal at great expense. So the first Grundy County Courthouse was built of heavy-hewn logs and beams. The clapboard siding was undressed oak. It could never be painted. Construction cost was $525. This was the only public building in Frontier Morris, so this is where people gathered for meeting of any kind. Church services of every denomination were held here, as well as school classes. But after time, the nails began to work their way out of the hardwood siding, and the Grundy County Courthouse began to look a little shabby. William Armstrong's brother Perry thought it was a disgrace. When he was elected county clerk in the fall of 1853, he refused to keep his office there and rented a room on the second floor of a frame building across the street. Perry made his point, and the next year one of the Morris supervisors offered a resolution that a new courthouse be built. After 13 years of service, the funny little building was sold and moved 3 miles north of town. The new building was built of Joliet stone, since there was no decent brick available in Morris at that time. It cost more, $22,000, but it would last 50 years. In 2 years, the building was completed in 1858. The lower floor was a courtroom with a door on each side. The second story was divided into 3 rooms of equal size with a stairway at the southeast corner. This is where the circuit clerk, county clerk, and recorder kept their offices. Then in 1912, after 54 years, the third courthouse was built at a cost of $72,385. The east and west walls of the former building were kept as retaining walls and can still be seen in the lobby. The courthouse square is a gallery of war history. The Indian pole is the oldest relic. This cedar pole originally stood at the south end of Wauponsee Street on top of a burial mound. The earliest settlers thought it belonged to Chief Wauponsee, and that's why they named the street after him, but he had nothing to do with it. Today this stick is terribly weathered, but when it was erected by the Indians sometime between 1680 and 1700, it was covered with hydro hieroglyphics describing the exploits of Chief Nuquet. He was of the Illini tribe, killed in a battle against the Iroquois, which started at Blue Island. Nuquet retreated to Joliet, fought again, then retreated to Nettle Creek, where he was killed. The burial mound was opened in 1837 when they were digging the canal. They found the body with a Jesuit missionary cross and some other items. Around 1930, the pole was moved to the courthouse lawn. Soldiers Monument commemorates the Grundy County soldiers who died in the Civil War. It was designed by Laredo Taft, who carved the face and hands on this statue himself. The statue alone is cut out of 2 tons of Vermont granite. The monument stands 46 foot high and was put up in 1889 at a cost of $5,000. Attempts at fundraising failed, so the county board appropriated the money. World War I is represented by this cannon. Pieces like this one were made available when the War Department was selling off obsolete field pieces at $10 each to any municipality that wanted one for decoration. So the Grundy County Board bought 3. Then during World War II, they decided to sell them for first-class scrap iron. The Korean-Vietnam Veterans Memorial, created by Pat Barron of Wilmington, preserves the images and names of area veterans of these 2 wars. Dedicated in 1991 and funded by donations from businesses and individuals, this memorial received first place in the Governor's Hometown Award Contest. The Grundy County Sheriff's Complex and jail at the southeast corner of the square was completed in 1975, replacing the stone structure built in 1876 just west of the courthouse. The jailer's house was attached to the back. This was actually the 3rd jail. The original was built in 1845. It was just a log building sitting on top of the dungeon, an underground hole 14 foot square and 12 foot deep, with a plank floor covered by an iron grate. The jailer had to raise and lower the convict by his wrists. In 1855, this inhumane situation was replaced with a brick building. The block opposite the courthouse to the east is occupied by D&S Foods. But this 1881 map shows that years ago this area was mostly occupied by agricultural businesses and warehouses. The stores in the Morris Business District were only built 20 feet wide. This warehouse district offered storage space for their barrels of merchandise. So this block was nearly bare when A.C. Varlin purchased most of it to set up Varlin's agricultural equipment. In 1952, he built the current building in the center of the lot for the National Tea Grocery Company and moved his own ag machinery business north of town. In 1958, the building was doubled in size with an addition made to the east. D&S moved in 1976. Before the canal was built, Marshall Pike, a real estate investor from Vermont, owned all the block frontage east of the courthouse square. And across the street, this corner has been occupied by boarding houses since the beginning of Morris history. In 1841, Robert Peacock built the first one. It was marked by a 3-foot signboard hanging from a crosspiece, painted with an old carry plow and the word "Inn" printed below. Robert Peacock served as justice of the peace for Canal Town, Morris, so the locals quipped that the plow inn meted out food for the hungry and justice for the unjust. In 1868, it was replaced by the Clifton House, built by a man named Kay for Mrs. John McQuiston, whose husband was killed in the Civil War. Here she could live and operate a boarding house to support her family. After her children grew up, she moved out, and Mr. Kay and his wife moved in and ran it until 1907, when it was turned into apartments. The old building was torn down in 1932 to make way for the new Morris Post Office. Looking directly across from the courthouse square to the north side of East Washington Street stands this two-story brick building built in 1877 by Charlie Spar and Jake Geisen. Can you see the boot hanging in the center? This was the Spar and Wolfel leather store during the tannery's heyday. In 1962, Charlie Spar Jr. sold it to the Grundy County Farm Bureau. George Wolfel built this brick building at the corner east of Washington and Franklin in 1879. The second floor was a music hall. Around 1880, this became the Morris Herald Building. In 1930, the west half of the building was purchased from the Spar estate, and this remained the Herald Corner for 97 years until the newspaper moved to North Division Street in 1983. To the west stands this fine example of Italianate commercial architecture, rectangular in shape with tall, thin windows and pronounced moldings and a string course dividing the 2 stories. It was built in 1872 by Max Frank. who operated Frank Brothers Clothing Store here. He started elsewhere on Wash Street, outgrew those quarters, bought this property from Mrs. Atwater, stayed 5 years, then sold out to Israel and Jacob Meyer. Turning west on Washington Street, looking at the south side, you see in the corner now occupied by Eagles Hall. This was a prime commercial location for early Moors. In 1842, a wooden building stood here, serving as a county recorder's office and post office. In 1853, the first bank in Morris was started on this corner by Charles and Henry Gould. It operated until 1860. In 1877, Lawrence Claypool built the present building of Lochsable stone, which is delivered by canal boat owned by C.F. Washburn, great-grandfather of former Mayor Bud Washburn. The lower floors served a succession of businesses. Ballman Schobert's Dry Goods on the west side, Scoville's Jewelry stood on the Liberty Street corner, and the Revolution took over the whole thing in the 1880s. The upper floors served as offices. Attorney Conrad Reardon had the corner office, followed by 3 generations of Peacocks. Next door, heading west, we focus on 105 West Washington, now Robinson Beeler Agency. This building was built in 1868 as Lyman B. Ray's dry goods store. Here he sold shoes and boots, gloves, parasols, and dress goods. The second floor was a carpet room. The owner, Lyman B. Ray, was elected to the Illinois State Legislature in 1882 and later became lieutenant governor. He helped organize the Grundy County Republican Party. The property now occupied by Kindlespar's Auto Supply was originally owned by John McNellis, a canal boat captain who opened a provision store here. In 1847, Horace Holbird and Lewis Lott opened a fine dry goods store here. It's also served as a gross and handwork hardware store and a Manhattan cafe. In 1893, Irwin Pierce lived upstairs. Here he built, installed, and operated Morris's first telephone switchboard until he sold out to the Chicago Telephone Company in 1900. Ray Kindlespar moved his business here in 1933. The ownership of Kindlespar's Auto spans 4 generations. This site goes back to the earliest canal days. In 1845, Mahlon Wilson built a boarding house here to provide bed and board for the canal workers. That little 16 by 24 foot structure was moved to the northeast corner of Division and Washington Street, where the post office is now, and became the kitchen for the Clifton House mentioned earlier. News reports of the day report that Dr. David Leroy opened his drugstore here in 1862 in a new 3-story brick building. Because it was brick, it survived the fire of 1867, which wiped out the rest of the block to the west. Strawberry Plant Boutique has been here since 1976. This was once the Prendergast block. In 1843, Michael Prendergast left Ottawa, came to Morris, and built a 2-story log cabin on this site. He opened a grocery store on one side and lived with his family on the other. After he was elected probate judge for the new county of Grundy, his new position went to his head. He started putting on airs, and as a result of his pompous behavior, he became the target of many practical jokes in this frontier town. Nevertheless, by 1868, he had amassed enough wealth to build this 2-story brick building, which held 3 stores on the ground level. Here, James Kinnear opened the First National Bank in 1874. In 1914, he applied the white glazed brick front and 7-foot plate glass windows. The corner of Washington and Fulton has a rich history. This was the original location for the Morris Cutlery business, which stayed here from 1882 to about 1889 before moving to the old plow factory. They manufactured about 84 different varieties of pocket knives, employing 21 skilled workmen, including 2 knife makers from Sheffield, England. Knives made at Morris Cutlery were said to be equal in style and finish to those of Wolstenholme and Sons in England, but they went out of business in 1930. In 1909, Northwestern Novelty Company operated here until moving to their present Armstrong location in 1912. It was founded by Emerson Boland, a farm boy from Ohio who began as a traveling salesman selling fireless cookers in South Africa and ended up in Morris inventing vending machines. The Yankee was Northwestern's first product. While living in Marion, Indiana, Emerson Boland stopped at a local pub for a glass of beer. Standing there at the bar, he patiently waited while the saloon keeper complained about the fistfuls of matches his customers were taking off the counter, to the point of cutting away his profits. Why not, thought Boland, find some way of providing free matches, yet graciously prevent the customer from stuffing their pockets. This small bar-top device was the answer. 100 matches were stored under the locking lid. When you pushed down the lever, a match popped out of an opening in the top. As you took hold of it, the match struck itself and emerged lit and ready to use. The end of the lever also held a cutter to nip off the end of your cigar. While in Chicago, Boland contracted the Coleman Hardware Company, which had a foundry at Morris, about 65 miles southwest of the city. Besides, Morris, like any small river town, was well populated with saloons, 23 of them in 1909. Word of this newcomer with a good thing spread, and soon Boland was approached by Earl Fuller, a recent college grad looking for a job, and Frank Hayes, an attorney with money to invest. The three of them formed Northwestern Corporation on $3,000 capital. Nelson Bottling was the last occupant of this building before it was torn down in 1975 to make way for the Shamlin Engineering Building. The current Davis Funeral Home has a long and checkered history. It was built around 1858 by Dr. Hanna and Dr. Leroy as a Ross House Hotel. These early investors figured the town would grow westward, but their building was dismissed as a monument of folly because the structure wasn't safe, even though ads for the hotel bragged up its large, clean, and well-ventilated rooms. Because of its out-of-the-way location and the depressed economy, Hanna and Leroy had trouble renting their building and lost on their investment. In 1869, Professor N.C. Dougherty started a normal school here, which failed. His successor also failed. Then in 1875, Jim Kincaid, a graduate of Washington College in Pennsylvania, took it over and managed to turn the school around. The Morris Normal and Scientific School flourished until the spring of 1877 when a brick fell from the cornice, then another. Within 5 minutes, the whole west side of the building came crashing down, pulling the floors and partitions with it. The Monument of Folly was built on a sandstone foundation. After the third owners rebuilt the structure, the school reopened and continued for 11 more years when the new and improved Morris High School put it out of business. Allen F. Mallory purchased it in 1889 and converted it into the commercial hotel. Its main draw was the Shibona mud baths. Mallory hired Lou Marsh from the Clifton House, and he gave the treatments in the hotel basement. The customer checked into the hotel, was taken down to the basement, and laid out on a table where he was covered with head to foot with hot mud. There he was left to bake for several hours, then given a series of baths alternating hot and cold, followed by a brisk rub-down with a thick Turkish towel. This treatment was supposed to cure everything from rheumatism to liver and kidney disorders. The secret was in the mud, pure peat from oak and hickory leaves pulled from the flowing water of a medicinal stream located 3 miles west of Morris. Mayor Cronin of Joliet swore by the Shibona mud bath treatment. He wanted to invest $5,000 to purchase the commercial hotel in the peatland where the mud came from. But the commercial hotel was sold in 1923, and the famed mud baths are now history. The building has been the Davis Funeral Home ever since. U.C. Davis removed the third floor, pebble-dashed the exterior, used the first floor as a funeral parlor, and rented out the second floor as apartments. In 1976, Tom Desiriak joined the firm and is now the owner. The southwest corner of Washington and Wauponsee Streets, where H&R Block now stands, was originally the site of the Parmalee Block, built in 1849 by Oliver Parmalee, who ran a drugstore and saloon on the ground floor and ran the second floor, known as Parmalee Hall, to the Morris School Board as a private school, until Center School was built in 1853. Henry Cooper built the current building as his harness shop in 1901. Crossing over to the north side of Washington Street stands the Brewster Building, built in 1877 by Mr. Brewster and James Horry. Wood buildings originally stood on this site, but fear of fire and high insurance rates convinced these owners to build with brick and stone. The Savings Bank store operated here during the early 1900s, opened by August Jensen, who bought and sold for cash, giving the customer most of the profit. Still the tallest building on the block, the Antique Mall, formerly Natasha's Furniture, was the Kennedy Block. As you can see, its roofline stood above the rest. The handsome cornice was graced by a bronze eagle, wings spread. It was built in 1879 at a cost of $6,585. The owner, William Kennedy, Esquire, came here from Ireland, worked on the canal, and began buying up canal land, eventually accumulating 280 acres, An early real estate mogul, he rented his investment out as a hardware store with a tin shop in back. In 1896, U.C. Davis purchased the property for a furniture and undertaking business. In 1925, he moved his furniture parlor to its current location across the street, and Lathe Furniture took over the furniture part of the business. 3 years later, he sold out to William Allen, who did extensive remodeling over the years. Now we'll walk along Liberty Street, heading north, following the growth of Morris in that direction as the city grew away from the I&M Canal toward a new and faster mode of transportation, the Rock Island Railroad. Starting with the east side of the street at the southernmost corner where the Grundy County National Bank building stands. During canal days, this corner was a grocery store operated by canal boat Captain Sam Hull. It was a 2-story frame building. He lived above the store. In 1867, it was moved east onto the Starbuck properties to make way for the bank, which was built by Mrs. Atwater and N.C. Petty. As you can see from this floor plan, it was a 2-story building with 3 storefronts. The bank stood on the corner. The upper floors facing the courthouse were favored by lawyers as office locations. The second story of this building was once Hull's Hall, or Hull's Opera House, the cultural center for Morris during the middle 1800s. This is where all the concerts, plays, dances, and banquets were held. It was named after canal boat Captain Samuel Hull. In 1910, Hull's Hall was renamed the Empire Theater, operating until 1930 when talking movies put the piano player out of business. Structural changes were made in the bank building in 1905, 1926, and again in 1964. This photo was taken in 1917. This brick building replaced a row of old wooden buildings owned by Mrs. Abigail Atwater. An early morning fire in June of 1873, fueled by the wooden awnings, reduced the site to an empty lot. A large cistern for fire protection was built under the sidewalk on the southwest corner of the bank, but this building caught fire again in 1983, destroying Marvin's clothing store. White's Cafe has been a restaurant from the very beginning. In 1867, Eli Johnson built his restaurant here. It has also been Windsor's, the Saratoga Cafe, Cock Bill's, and Hull's. The oldest eating place in Morris, it's still the place downtown where you can get all the news and gossip over a cup of coffee. The second story is apartments, and in the alley there's a chute where stock can be slid down to the basement. At the corner of Liberty and Main stands the Streeter Block, named after the original owner. It replaced the old wooden frame boarding house and saloon run by John McNellis, which was moved west to Washington Street in 1860. The new building had 3 stores on the ground floor. The corner was Abe Longworth's drugstore until I.W. Bean bought him out. Bean took on a partner, John Brown, who eventually took over. This corner remained a drugstore under various owners for 70 years, until 1932 when it became the Grundy County Republican headquarters. In 1873, Beach's dry goods store moved here, carrying a heavy load of yard goods, Irish poplins, linen suit material, and gross grain silk. Their clothing department had an experienced cutter. Here a gentleman could choose his own cloth, be measured and fitted with a new suit. They also had the most extensive inventory of crockery and glassware in the city, as well as the largest carpet department. Beach's also sold groceries, buying and selling for cash when farmers came to town to trade. This third store was a grocery. The second floor was used for offices, and the third was a meeting room known as Baum's Hall, where Henry Baum took over Beach's Dry Goods in 1888. This was Henry Baum's final store location. Starting in 1874 to 1877, he was in partnership with his brother-in-law, John Schobert, where the Morris Bakery is now. Then he moved to the Claypool Building. The partnership split. Baum moved to Iowa for 6 years and came back to the Streeter Block in 1888. In 1906, the store was remodeled and furnished with electric lights and steam heat. The exterior was rebuilt in 1964 and the new brick facing applied. Today, the Baum family is distinguished as owning the oldest business in Morris and the oldest brick block on Liberty Street. The northeast corner of Liberty and Main was a focal point of Canal Town, Morris. The Grundy Hotel once stood on this spot, built by William Armstrong in November 1841. This tavern was the principal hotel for Morris for 10 years until it burned in February 1851. This is where the townfolk gathered to trip the light fantastic to the tune of Thomas Burr on the fiddle, George Kiersted on the flute, and Tom Henry's clarinet. After it burned, it was replaced in 1854 by the Hopkins House, a frame 4-story hotel with stores, built by Judge William Hopkins. Down in the basement was George Washington Foster's barber shop. On August 20th, 1858, Abraham Lincoln stopped here for a shave before heading to Ottawa on the Rock Island to debate Stephen Douglas. In 1888, the Hopkins house burnt and the lot stood empty for 3 years until Dr. Smith built this two-story brick store in 1891. The Knights of Pythias had club rooms upstairs. Dr. Smith had his office in the corner. Downstairs was Erickson's Grocery. In 1927, Hornsby's Variety Store moved in, followed by Coast to Coast after Hornsby built a bigger store on Waverly Street. U.C. Davis had his furniture and funeral home here before moving to 112 West Washington Street in 1896. Other tenants included Herman Mann's Clothing and the National Tea Grocery. Abe Skloot started at 414 Liberty in 1928 and moved here around 1932 to establish Skloot's Menswear. Bert Newport built this brick building in 1928 to replace the two wooden stores built by Charles Comerford in 1867. In 1928, the Newport Hotel was located upstairs and Newport's hardware store was downstairs. In 1929, he bought the 15th Ace Hardware Store franchise. It was later Schultz Brothers Variety Store. Today it's owned by Bob Funk, who operates the second floor apartments and the Liberty Health Mart. Phil Hart built this two-story brick building in 1866 for his Star Saloon. The two stores to the north were later made into one store. In 1956, a major fire here damaged both the glass kitchen and the Gene and Jim Tog Shop. Story Madison bought this site from the Jacob Griggs estate around 1895 and built this two-story brick building. Mr. Madison opened a livery and sales barn here and put Durley McKean in charge. Later was owned by Ole Erickson and Son as a dry goods store. When Erickson retired, Charles Muffler purchased the building and opened Muffler's Auto Supply and Ace Hardware. The second floor has been used as a roller skating rink and a shooting gallery. Across Jackson Street stands the Homan Building with its striking cupola, built around 1900. S.C. Mackey ran a grocery store here beginning in 1905 until 1942. He watched the Interurban Electric Railroad being built down Liberty Street from his store window. When it finally opened, he bought the first ticket for a nickel. The Morris Theater Guild Playhouse has been performing amateur theatrics here since early 1980, but this was built by the Free Methodist Church in 1890. The Morris congregation was part of a Pentecostal band organized in 1887 and included Mazan and Gardner. This continued as their church until 1966, when their new building on Armstrong Street was dedicated in 1966. In 1920, Hal Osmondson purchased the Fred Nichols residence plus a small store which formerly stood on this property. He planned to build the biggest building of its kind in Morris, 60 feet by 125 feet, 2 stories, all brick, with a plate glass front. A large elevator would go up to the second floor, big enough to store anything. In 1952, a single-story addition was added to the rear facing Benton Street, and the second-floor warehouse was converted into apartments. Thinly disguised under the bright red roof is the old Interurban Depot, built in 1911 by the Illinois Traction System at a cost of about $5,000. This was the depot and powerhouse for the Fox and Illinois Union Electric Railway, which ran from Morris to Aurora. The first test ride ran between Morris and Seneca in 1910. Round-trip tickets were 20 cents. In 1911, the Morris Industrial Association raised $11,000 to pay for the right-of-way obtained in 1913. Here in town, the cars ran down Liberty Street from Benton to Washington, then turned west onto Fulton before heading north. The coming of the automobile killed the Interurban. Near the corner of Liberty and Benton Street, the Gable Grocery and Hotel was built in 1930. Con Gable and his son Clarence built this ground floor store and 13-room hotel after their frame building burned in 1929. On February 3, 1935, robbers entered the grocery, shot and killed night watchman Clarence Roslin, took Herman Gable and Merle Ward hostage, and made off with some $60 in cash. The entire episode was captured in lurid detail in True Detective magazine. Liberty Street Bar and Restaurant was built as the Patrick Tavern in 1859. When Mr. Patrick died, his wife married Tom Carson. The original building was small, so Carson moved in a house from Jefferson Street and attached it to the south end of the tavern. Next, he added a two-story, 30 by 44-foot addition on the east side, making the north side 75 feet long. This building has a three-part double brick insulated basement, which caused a real problem for firemen when the basement of the Colonial Saloon caught fire and was gutted in 1908. At that time, it was run by Tan Allen, a grandson of Mrs. Carson. In 1919, William Gebhardt owned this property, and he closed the hotel because the rooms weren't attracting enough guests. When Dale Wren owned the building in 1979, he removed a third of the south section to make way for parking. Directly across the street on the west side of Liberty stands Beatty's Lumber Company. It was built in 1977. Thomas Ross founded this company in 1885, locating it along the right-of-way of the Chicago Rock Island close to the depot. The yard and sheds cover 2 blocks, one of the largest in the state at the time it was built. It could hold 1 million board feet. I&R Beatty specialized in putting up houses on a monthly payment plan. The business has operated in the same location by the Beatty family for over 100 years. Heading south now back toward the canal was stopped at the Morse Library. This building was completed in 1971 with an addition made to the north in 1992, which moved the children's department upstairs and created a meeting room downstairs. This replaced the original building built in 1913 from a donation of $12,500 given by Andrew Carnegie, the last Carnegie library to be built. Prior to this building, the Morse Library Association formed in 1873, operating a 100-volume collection from the Morse City Hall. Today, the Morse Area Public Library houses 35,000 volumes, plus audio books, video cassettes, computers with internet access, and offers a variety of educational and entertaining programs for area residents to enjoy. Tom's Tire Service on the other side of North Street was built the same year by the McCormick brothers, who started selling Model Ts. In 1914, they sold 161 Fords. The following year, the Ford Motor Company upped the quota to 200 cars. So the brothers gave up the agency, selling out to Herman Bartlett in 1920, who ran it until 1929 when Charles Muffler bought the building. Before the automobile, this was the site of the Riverside Livery. Later in the 1920s to 40s, Dr. Reagan ran his veterinarian barn here. On a Saturday night, a farmer coming to town could see a lame colt or a sick pig in one of the stalls and talk to Doc till 10 p.m. The southwest corner of Liberty and Jackson is dominated by the Collins Building, built in 1905 by Jeremiah Collins for his Farmers and Merchants Bank and for Madison's Hardware. The first Morris Hospital occupied 2 flats at the northeast corner of the 3rd floor until it moved to its present location in 1909. Farmers and Merchants Bank merged with the Grundy County National Bank in 1931. Madison's Hardware was purchased by Jerry Madison from his Uncle Price in 1955 and continued to operate here until the fall of 1976, when it was moved to its current location at Liberty and Bedford Road. If you look above the McGrath office equipment lettering on the building next door, you can see this building was built by Cronin in 1905. Tom and Dan Cronin were twins who left farming to go into the hardware business. These 3 stores burned in 1921 at a cost of $30,000 to Fessler Plumbing and the Erickson Garage and Auto Showroom. Fessler first rebuilt the store on the left in 1921 for the Andan Restaurant. The middle store was rebuilt 5 years later to house Moore Savings Loan, the Chamber of Commerce, Meyer Real Estate, and his own plumbing business. That same year, Leo Ahern rebuilt the store on the right as Gold's, the working man's army store. About 1875, O.R. Height, a shoemaker, built this building. The first story was brick, the second was wood, later bricked over in 1910. In 1919, owner C.D. Young decided to build a basement underneath the building. While trying to put in a new footing, the 12-foot-high south wall collapsed in the basement and spread into the street. The merchandise and fixtures of the old Cool store stood exposed to the elements. By 1922, Cool had real financial problems, so Will and Art Hornsby took over his $2,800 banknote, and Hornsby's Variety Store was born. The cornice on this building reads, Roth, 1916. In 1890, Bernard Roth came to Morris to work for the R. Bernard Bakery. After Bernard died in 1909, Roth purchased the wooden buildings, and he and his wife ran the bakery. After Bernard died, his wife ran it until their son took over in 1960. The bakery closed in 1977. Another son, Dr. Roth Sr., kept his office upstairs before ending the service. After World War II, he moved his office downstairs to the Jefferson Street side. Dr. Roth Jr. has continued his practice in his father's office, expanding it into the Morris Medical Center. His brother Bob runs the Roth Insurance Agency at the bakery site, plus part of the Smith Building to the south, which was purchased in 1953. Louis Gibhart was successful in his brewery business, investing his assets in civic improvements for the city of Morris by donating land, putting in sidewalks, and erecting business blocks like this one. The ground floor of the new Gibhart building was occupied by Peterson Grocery, Cronin Brothers Hardware, and the Soxy Saloon. The second floor had living apartments facing the street with a Masonic banquet room in back. The entire third floor was a Masonic hall. William Selleck probably built this two-story brick store in 1868 on the stone foundation of a former bakery. The entire store was gutted by fire in 1916. The new sign front on Red Carpet Travel at the corner of Liberty and Main is the only major exterior alterations to what still looks like the first trust and savings bank built in 1916. In 1930, it emerged with the First National Bank. By 1967, it outgrew this location and moved to a new facility on West Main Street. The Heinz Building, now occupied by Hanover Linens and Heinz Law Offices, is the site of one of the first stores to be built in Morris. In 1843, Bartholomew McGrath, a canal contractor, built the Morris Hotel here. In 1845, the American House dry goods store was opened here by Charles Gould and a man named Peirce. It burnt in 1868 and was rebuilt in 1887 as the Johnston and Stalker block. Eli Johnson ran a confectionery and news depot. Stalker ran a saloon. In 1910, the building was completely remodeled. Heinz Shoe Store was located in back, facing Main Street. C.H. Heinz Dry Goods faced south, and the T.H. Hall Dry Goods was on the corner, which was later bought out by Heinz, who combined the three stores into one operating until 1960. The building with the decorative folios on the cornice was built in 1877 as a saloon, built by Noble Robinson, who went into partnership with William Allen on this venture after he broke his leg farming. This is one of three Auxable sandstone commercial buildings in Morris, the other two having been refaced. Today, the Edward Jones Investment Company is located in the Keller Block built by M.K. in 1876. He started clerking in a grocery store in Pennsylvania at age 14, then came to Morris in 1855 and opened his own. The brick in this building was made locally at the Martin Brickyard. This prime piece of property squaring the northwest corner of Liberty and Washington Street is the Pike Block, originally occupied by a single wooden building, a millinery store, which H.C. Gould moved over to Canal Street for a house in order to build this storefront building in 1874. This has also been called the Gould Block because H.C. Gould's drugstore stood on this corner. H.C. came to Morris in 1848 and started in the banking and real estate business with his brother. In 1867, he sold out to him and started his drugstore. For years, various millinery establishments occupied the bakery building. Stepping across Washington Street stands the Seaman Building, built in 1870. Magnus Hurry's blacksmith shop is the earliest known tenant as of 1877. Shan Miller and George DePaster built this double building together in 1891. Miller ran his implement business here and DePaster had his marble works. In 1856, Lawrence Claypool owned all this frontage along Liberty Street from Washington Street to the banks of the canal. Until recent years, this end of the block has been used for agriculture and automobile businesses. Moving west now onto Main Street, we come to the Harder Apartment Building, which dates back to 1867 when Phil Lear built this 40 by 60 foot gabled roof hotel in the middle of the block. Around 1869, Conrad Wagner bought it and named it the Washington House. The hotel had 50 large, comfortable rooms, and meals were included. The center section was built to the west in 1875. 2 years later, the Waponsie Street section was added for carriage and stables with a courtyard in the center, and the original frame hotel was given brick siding. During 1910 to 1920, Art Harder and Dr. Whitman converted the old hotel into apartments and is now owned by the third generation of the Harder family. Directly across the street stands the DePaster Building, which replaced another Morris saloon in 1877 to become a sales room for marble and granite monuments. The first Midwest Bank building on West Main Street was built in 1967 to replace the old building at the corner of Liberty and Main. A drive-up facility was added to the north in 1975. In 1981, the second story was added. The parking lots did away with 2 doctors' offices. Dr. Bauker's office was removed to make way for the north parking, and Dr. Tratt's was taken out for the south lot. This Morris landmark was built around 1900 by Dr. Nelson for his home and office. Later, S.S. Marvick lived here, and then W.F. Page, who sold it to T.A. Hoganson in 1926. In January of that year, the Grundy County Bank notified Hoganson that we'd have to vacate his furniture and undertaking business on Liberty Street to make way for the remodeling and expansion. Mr. Hoganson decided to relocate in the Page house because it was conveniently located close to downtown, yet the big old house would also duplicate the comforts of a home funeral. The second floor could be used as a residence. In 1948, Earl Fruland became owner. His son Paul joined the business in 1955 and has operated since 1973. Around the corner on West Jefferson Street stands the straightforward brick building. Built in 1917 for the Morris Motor Company Ford distributor by F.M. Washburn, son of Captain C.F. Washburn, a canal boat operator and merchant. His grandson James R. Bud Washburn is the present owner. The Morris Theater on East Jefferson goes back to the Great Depression when Fred Anderson, manager of the Rialto Theater in Coal City, announced that he was building this new theater in Morris. With the help of the Chamber of Commerce and Stevens Lumber Company, he put up a $100,000 theater whose sound projection system won a national award for excellence. On opening day, July 16, 1930, 600 people stood in line to buy 50-cent tickets to see the Great Pond. In 1940, Anderson also opened the Times Theater on Liberty Street. Then in 1996, the old Morris Theater closed after the new Malta Cinema opened on Gore Road. The hub of Morris stands here at the corner of Jefferson and Wauponsee, the Morris City Hall. Now housed in the former Morris Federal Savings and Loan Building, replacing the former building built in 1868 with a newer brick portion to the north added on 42 years later. The tall standpipe behind the building is the old Morris Waterworks. This standpipe system stood 125 feet high and held 100,000 gallons of water with direct pumpage for fires. There was one attendant on duty part-time, but the 1917 fire insurance report stated this was inadequate and the system was removed. The Morris Fire Department has been indispensable in preserving the canal town Morris to the present. It began with a group of 7 concerned citizens who organized the Eagle Hose Company in November of 1869. The original equipment included 1 hose reel, a hook and ladder truck, and a steam fire engine finally called Old Shabona. Canal Town Morris has been the backdrop for a long history of over 150 years. The Liberty Street Parade route reflects its peak moments. The street has been paved and repaved. Storefronts have come and gone, but the roofline silhouette remains basically the same. We have 50 histories and pictures in frames in the stores. The mud streets and the names have changed, but the cornices are still there to remind us of the history they have survived. The downtown, the Morris Library, and I hope you have enjoyed our trip into the past.